The police arrived within 20 minutes, their vehicles appearing on the high street with the casual inevitability of a familiar routine, interrupted. Inspector Graves, a lean, competent man of some 50 years who had policed St. Mary Mead with admirable efficiency for the past decade, stepped out of the lead car with an air of professional resignation. He had, over the course of his career, learned that village emergencies rarely involve the straightforward facts they initially appeared to present. Miss Marple watched from her window as the police made their way up toward Ashworth Manor, located some half-mile beyond the village proper on a gentle rise of parkland. The manor itself was a handsome Georgian structure of red brick and pale stone, handsome in that peculiarly English way that suggested inheritance rather than ambition. She had been a guest there on several occasions. Constance, whatever her faults, maintained certain social proprieties, and she could visualize precisely the staircase in question. It was a grand affair of polished oak, sweeping upward from the entrance hall in a generous curve, lined with portraits of Ashworths stretching back to the 17th century. A fall down those stairs would indeed be fatal, particularly for a woman of Constance's age and constitution. Miss Marple had settled herself into her armchair with her knitting when Lucy returned an hour later, having gleaned further intelligence from the village's informal but remarkably efficient communication network. The situation, it appeared, was as follows. Constance Ashworth had returned to the manor at approximately 4 o'clock, having left the bazaar early due to her troublesome knees. She had been seen by Mrs. Pemberton, the housekeeper, entering the front door in a state of some agitation. Mrs. Pemberton had offered to fetch her tea, but Constance had waved her away irritably, stating she wished to rest in her room and was not to be disturbed. At 5:30, Mrs. Pemberton had heard a terrible crash from the stairwell, a sound of unmistakable violence followed by an awful silence. The housekeeper had rushed out to find Constance at the bottom of the stairs, her body at an unnatural angle, quite evidently beyond immediate help. The doctor had been summoned, and the police had been telephoned. By the time help arrived, Constance Ashworth was dead. There had, Lucy reported with the breathlessness of one conveying genuine shock, been no witnesses to the fall itself. Miss Marple continued her knitting with undiminished focus, though her mind was engaged in a more complex work. The absence of witnesses was itself noteworthy, as was the curious fact that Constance had been found alone in the house at the moment of her death. Surely a woman of Constance's station maintained more staff than merely a housekeeper. Lucy confirmed that there were 2 other servants, a cook and a scullery maid, both of whom had been given the afternoon off on account of the bazaar. Only Mrs. Pemberton had remained in the manor. The evening progressed into darkness, and with it came further developments. Around 9 o'clock, as Miss Marple was preparing for bed, she observed vehicles arriving once again at the manor, this time, significantly, a second police car and what appeared to be a plain-clothes detective from the county constabulary. The change in the nature of the police response suggested that Inspector Graves had decided something warranted deeper investigation. Miss Marple slept poorly that night, as she often did when her mind had engaged a puzzle. She rose at her usual hour of 6 o'clock, took her breakfast of toast and marmalade, and was dressed and composed by the time the village began its morning routines. By 8:30, the telephone lines were humming with speculation. The accident, it transpired, had not been ruled an accident at all. The precise details emerged throughout the morning via the reliable conduit of Mrs. Timpson at the post office, who had received intelligence from her cousin's husband, who worked in the household of the vicar, who had received a visit from Inspector Graves himself, seeking to establish a timeline of events. What had emerged from this investigation was troubling. Mrs. Pemberton, upon careful examination, reported that Constance had seemed not merely agitated, but actively distressed when she returned from the bazaar. Moreover, when the police had examined the staircase in daylight, they had found several details that suggested the fall may not have been entirely accidental. There was, for instance, a peculiar scuff mark on the corridor wall near the top of the stairs, the sort of mark that might be caused by a hand grasping for support or by a body striking wood during a violent collision. There was also, more damningly, a distance between the scattered items that had been in Constance's possession when she fell, her handbag, her gloves, her walking stick, that suggested a less than straightforward tumble. None of this, Miss Marple reflected, constituted proof of anything whatsoever. An old woman might grasp at a wall, might scatter her possessions across a considerable area, might fall in any number of ways that would leave uncertain evidence in its wake. And yet the police clearly shared her sense that something in the official narrative required deeper examination. By noon, it was common knowledge that the police had requested that certain members of the household, and indeed certain residents of the village, remain available for questioning. Among those specifically named was Robert Ashworth, who had been seen at the bazaar shortly before his mother's departure. Also named were David Ashworth and his daughter Emily, both of whom resided at the manor. Most intriguingly, Laura Ashworth had been politely but firmly requested to remain in the village pending further inquiries. Miss Marple absorbed these facts with her characteristic composure, though, internally, pieces of a puzzle were beginning to arrange themselves in patterns that troubled her considerably. She thought of Emily's trembling hands as she held the cream-colored cardigan. She thought of the cardigan's initials, worked in pale blue silk. She thought of Laura's expression when her ex-husband had approached her at the bazaar, that mixture of compassion and something darker. And she thought, with a sense of gathering certainty, of the timing, of who had been present at the bazaar when Constance received whatever news had caused her to depart so abruptly, of who stood to benefit from Constance Ashworth's death. As afternoon settled into early evening, Miss Marple did something she rarely did. She called upon Inspector Graves at the police station and requested a private conversation. Inspector Graves had the particular expression of a man accustomed to being consulted by elderly village residents about matters that ranged from genuinely significant to concerningly trivial. When Miss Marple was shown into his office at the police station, a modest room overlooking the high street, decorated with the austere functionality of institutional spaces, he rose with the courtesy owed to age and local standing, though his eyes betrayed a mild skepticism about what wisdom an 83-year-old spinster might impart, regarding a matter that appeared, on its surface, to be one of simple domestic accident. Miss Marple settled herself in the chair opposite his desk with deliberate care, arranging her hands in her lap with the composure of someone entirely at ease. "Inspector," she began, her voice carrying the gentle authority that came from a lifetime of being taken seriously, despite her unassuming appearance. "I have lived in St. Mary Mead for nearly 60 years. In that time I have developed certain observations about human nature and the patterns of village life that, while perhaps lacking the scientific rigor of your professional training, have occasionally proved useful in matters of this precise nature." Graves inclined his head in acknowledgement, his skepticism softening slightly. He had in fact encountered Miss Marple on 2 previous occasions when her insights had proven remarkably acute. "I've been reflecting," Miss Marple continued, "on the events preceding Mrs. Constance Ashworth's death. I attended the bazaar this afternoon, as did most of the village. I observed several matters that I believe warrant your attention, not as accusations, you understand, but as observations that might illuminate the sequence of events." She proceeded, without undue hurry, to recount what she had witnessed. She described Emily Prescott's reaction to the cream-colored cardigan, the girl's visible distress, her trembling hands, the pallor that had overcome her. She mentioned the cardigan's origin, Harrods, London, its pristine condition, and most significantly, the embroidered initials that identified it as belonging to Laura Ashworth. Graves leaned forward slightly, his professional interest visibly engaged. "The question that occupied my mind," Miss Marple continued, "was why a garment belonging to Laura Ashworth would be donated to a charity bazaar, and more particularly, why its appearance would cause such visible distress to Mrs. Ashworth's granddaughter." Young Emily is a sensitive child, but not typically one given to theatrical displays of emotion. Something about that cardigan held profound significance for her. She paused, allowing this observation to settle. Furthermore, Inspector, I observed Mr. Robert Ashworth's arrival at the bazaar this afternoon. He appeared agitated, excited, one of those states that men sometimes adopt when they bear news they anticipate will be unwelcome. Sir, he communicated something to his mother in low tones, and Mrs. Ashworth's reaction was immediate and pronounced. She departed the bazaar shortly thereafter, stating her knees troubled her. This was, I might add, a somewhat transparent excuse, as Mrs. Ashworth's knees are remarkably selective in their moments of protest. They rarely trouble her when matters of genuine interest occupy her attention. Graves was now making notes, his initial skepticism entirely replaced by professional attention. What I would submit to your consideration, Miss Marple said, her voice remaining measured and calm, is that whatever information Mr. Robert Ashworth communicated at the bazaar distressed his mother sufficiently to send her home in considerable agitation. The question becomes, what could that information have been? And does it bear any relationship to the circumstances of her subsequent fall? The inspector set down his pen and regarded Miss Marple with renewed respect. You raise legitimate points, Miss Marple. We have, in fact, already begun inquiries along similar lines. What we have discovered is that Robert Ashworth received a telephone call at his office this morning. The call came from a solicitor in London. The solicitor represents Laura Ashworth regarding certain matters concerning her late husband's estate and her daughter Emily's inheritance. He allowed this information to settle before continuing. The specific matter in question concerns a sum of money, approximately £5,000, that was left to Emily in trust by her maternal grandmother. Constance Ashworth had been serving as trustee of this fund. It appears that Laura has discovered evidence suggesting that a considerable portion of those funds may have been misappropriated over the years. Miss Marple's expression did not shift, though her fingers twisted together more tightly in her lap, a sign of the intensity of her concentration. That is indeed significant, she observed quietly. The cardigan, you see, becomes rather more comprehensible in this light. A garment from Laura's past, donated to the bazaar by someone with access to the manor. Emily recognized it, understood what its presence implied, and was devastated by that knowledge. A granddaughter seeing evidence that her grandmother had betrayed her trust. Precisely, Graves agreed, and that knowledge would have spread rapidly through the village had it become public. Mrs. Ashworth was, by all accounts, a woman of considerable pride regarding her reputation and standing. The threat of public exposure regarding financial impropriety would have been— He paused, the implication hanging between them. Deeply distressing, Miss Marple completed quietly. Sufficiently distressing, perhaps, to cause a woman already agitated to lose her footing on a staircase she had descended hundreds of times without incident. Or sufficiently distressing, Graves said, his voice deliberately neutral, to constitute a motive for someone else to ensure that she did precisely that. The two regarded each other across the desk in the fading light of early evening, the unspoken complexity of the situation settling between them like frost on a winter morning. Miss Marple remained silent for a long moment, her pale eyes fixed on some point beyond the inspector's shoulder, as though contemplating a matter of profound philosophical importance. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of hard-won understanding. However, Inspector, I wonder if we are not both making an assumption that may prove premature. Yes, Constance Ashworth had motive. The exposure of financial misconduct would have been ruinous to her reputation. But motive alone does not constitute guilt. One must also consider opportunity, and more importantly, the psychological weight of such an act. Pushing a woman down a staircase requires not merely anger or fear, but a specific kind of moral courage, or moral bankruptcy if you prefer. It requires the ability to commit deliberate violence and then to maintain composure while the consequences unfold. Graves set down his pen and leaned back in his chair, regarding her with the attentiveness of a student who had recognized a superior intellect. "What do you suggest, Miss Marple?" "I suggest," she said carefully, "that we consider who had both motive and immediate proximity to act. Robert Ashworth was at the bazaar when he received the solicitor's call. He communicated something to his mother, and she departed. But Robert himself remained at the bazaar for some time afterward. I observed him speaking with various people until at least 3:45. He could not have been at the manor when his mother fell at approximately 4:30. "The housekeeper corroborates that timeline," Graves confirmed. "Mrs. Pemberton heard the crash and immediately discovered Constance's body. She has been remarkably consistent in her account." "Mrs. Pemberton," Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. "A woman of how many years, Inspector?" "Approximately 60. She's been employed at the manor for 30 years. "And her financial circumstances?" Graves consulted his notes. "Modest. She lives in a cottage, provided by the Ashworth estate, receives a small pension, has no family of means. By all accounts, she is entirely dependent upon the Ashworth household for her security in her declining years." Miss Marple's expression grew more thoughtful still. "Then we must consider what Constance's death might mean for her. Does the new heir, presumably Robert as the elder son, intend to maintain existing arrangements?" "That has not been clarified," Graves admitted. "The will has not yet been read, though we have determined that Robert stands to inherit the bulk of the estate. There are, however, other interested parties." He rose and moved to a filing cabinet from which he extracted a folder. "David Ashworth inherits a modest annuity. Emily receives the remainder of her trust fund, properly administered this time. Laura receives nothing, which is as she anticipated. They were divorced after all. But there is a secondary matter that has emerged from our preliminary investigation." He withdrew several papers from the folder. "It appears that David Ashworth had been making rather persistent inquiries regarding his late ex-wife's return to the village. The innkeeper at the Crown Hotel reports that David visited the establishment on no fewer than 6 occasions over the past 3 weeks, apparently attempting to ascertain the nature and duration of Laura's stay. Mrs. Pemberton also reports hearing him on the telephone from the manor on several evenings, his voice raised in what appeared to be heated conversation." Miss Marple absorbed this information with evident interest. "With whom was he speaking?" "That we have not yet determined. The telephone exchange records show calls placed from the manor, but not their destinations. However, Miss Marple, I confess I am uncertain how this information bears upon the matter at hand. David Ashworth was reportedly resting in his room when his mother fell. Emily was in the village proper, at her friend Margaret's house, working on preparations for her school needlework examination. There are witnesses to both accounts." "And yet," Miss Marple said softly, "one observes certain patterns emerging. A man distressed by his ex-wife's return, a young girl discovering evidence of her grandmother's financial betrayal, a housekeeper whose security depends upon the maintenance of existing arrangements, a solicitor's letter that precipitated a crisis, and, most intriguingly, a cream-colored cardigan, a garment of such quality and deliberate folding that suggests not mere donation, but message." She paused, her weathered hands trembling very slightly in her lap. "Tell me, Inspector, when you examined the staircase this morning, did you notice anything unusual about the carpet runner, the one that runs down the center of the stairs?" Graves frowned, consulting his notes. There was a slight displacement noted. One of the brass rods that secures it appeared loose. We assumed it had been dislodged during the fall itself. "But might it," Miss Marple suggested gently, "have been loosened deliberately beforehand? A carpet runner that catches the foot of an already agitated woman descending stairs she traverses without attention because she has done so thousands of times. A woman whose mind is occupied with thoughts of exposure and ruin." The inspector's expression shifted as the implications crystallized before him. "You are suggesting not deliberate murder, but the creation of conditions likely to cause an accident." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there exists a substantial distance between pushing someone down a staircase and loosening a carpet runner. One is unquestionably murder. The other might constitute merely negligence, recklessness, or the actions of someone who wished for an accident to occur, but did not actively commit one themselves." She rose from her chair with the slow deliberation of advanced age. "Which raises the question, Inspector, who among the interested parties possessed both the knowledge of the manor's layout and the opportunity to loosen a carpet rod before 4 o'clock this afternoon? Who knew that Constance would return home agitated and preoccupied? And most significantly, who stood to benefit not merely from Constance's death, but from her death appearing to be the tragic consequence of her own distraction?" As Miss Marple made her way toward the door, leaving the inspector in profound contemplation of these questions, the autumn evening had deepened into full darkness beyond the police station windows. Somewhere in that darkness, the truth remained concealed, waiting for the precise moment when it would be illuminated by understanding. The following morning dawned gray and uncertain, as though the weather itself had absorbed something of the village's collective unease. Miss Marple, having slept fitfully despite, or perhaps because of, the clarity that had emerged during her conversation with Inspector Graves, rose early and attended to her morning correspondence with her characteristic methodical approach. Yet her mind was engaged elsewhere, working through the intricate calculus of human motivation and the precise choreography of events that had led to Constance Ashworth's death. By mid-morning, the police had expanded their inquiries considerably. Inspector Graves, operating on the theoretical framework Miss Marple had presented, had begun examining the manor more thoroughly. The carpet runner on the staircase had indeed been deliberately loosened, a fact confirmed by the groundskeeper who reported that the brass securing rods had shown signs of recent tampering, inconsistent with the wear pattern of 30 years' use. Moreover, a search of the manor's household accounts revealed that Constance had discovered the financial irregularities weeks earlier and had begun making inquiries that would have led inevitably to public disclosure. What remained unresolved was the identity of the person who had loosened that carpet runner. Miss Marple was attending to her knitting. The pale lavender cardigan was nearly complete when Lucy arrived at her door shortly after noon, her face bearing the particular expression of someone conveying news of considerable significance. Robert Ashworth had been taken to the police station for further questioning. This development had emerged after Inspector Graves had made a seemingly casual inquiry regarding Robert's movements on the morning of the bazaar, specifically whether he had visited the manor at any point before appearing at the event itself. Robert had initially denied this. Upon pressed questioning, however, he had admitted to arriving at the manor at approximately 2 o'clock, some hours before his mother's death, ostensibly to collect certain estate documents from his office in the manor's library. He had, he claimed, left the manor at 2:15, driven directly to the bazaar, and had been present there continuously until his mother's departure precipitated his departure as well. What Robert had not initially mentioned was that his visit to the manor had been undertaken in considerable haste and agitation. The housemaid, when questioned more thoroughly, reported that she had observed him moving rapidly through the corridors, his face flushed, his manner suggesting preoccupation or distress. She had, in fact, heard him on the telephone in the library, his voice raised in what she characterized as heated remonstrance. More damning still, the groundskeeper reported that Robert had specifically visited the upper corridor, the one containing the main staircase, claiming that he wished to examine the condition of a particular window that had reportedly been causing drafts. This visit had occurred between 2:15 and 2:30, precisely the window of time during which forensic examination now suggested the carpet runner had been loosened. By late afternoon, the village was alive with speculation. Robert Ashworth had not yet been charged with anything, but the direction of the investigation had become transparently clear to even the most casual observer. The police were operating on the theory that Robert, Having learned of the financial improprieties that would tarnish his family name and potentially necessitate restitution from the estate, had decided to prevent their exposure by engineering circumstances that would result in his mother's death before she could take public action. It was a theory, Miss Marple reflected, that possessed the considerable virtue of logic and circumstantial coherence. And yet something within it troubled her, a small discordance, a note that did not quite harmonize with the larger composition of events. She was contemplating this dissonance when a visitor arrived at her door. Laura Ashworth, looking considerably more worn than she had at the bazaar, her face drawn, her dark eyes shadowed with exhaustion, requested a private conversation. Miss Marple received her. In the sitting room, offered her tea, which Laura declined, and settled herself to listen with the profound attention that had characterized her entire life. "Miss Marple," Laura began, her voice carrying a tremor that suggested considerable emotional distress, "I've come to you because I believe the police are pursuing an investigation based upon incomplete information. I have information that I believe they should possess, but I was uncertain how to present it without causing unnecessary pain to persons who have already suffered considerably." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "you should simply state the truth. In my experience, Miss Ashworth, the truth, however painful, is invariably preferable to the alternative." Laura drew a shaky breath. The financial improprieties that Constance committed were not undertaken in ignorance or carelessness. They were undertaken with the full knowledge and assistance of another person, someone who benefited directly from those improprieties, and who stood to lose considerably if they came to light. She paused, her hands twisting together in her lap, a gesture eerily reminiscent of Miss Marple's own nervous habit when deeply engaged in thought. "That person is David Ashworth. My ex-husband has been receiving regular distributions from Emily's trust fund for the past 8 years. Constance was funneling money to him through the trust account. When I returned to the village, I obtained documentation proving this arrangement. I was preparing to take that documentation to the solicitor, which is when Robert became aware of the situation." Miss Marple set down her teacup with careful deliberation. "And what, precisely, was Robert's response to this knowledge?" "He was devastated," Laura said quietly. "Not merely because of the financial impropriety, but because he realized that his father, a man he had respected despite everything, had been complicit in this theft. David, you see, was not in his room resting on the afternoon of the bazaar. He was at the manor. He arrived through the servants' entrance at approximately 2 o'clock, when he knew Constance would be absent at the bazaar." The implications crystallized before Miss Marple with the force of sudden illumination. "And it was David," she said softly, "who loosened the carpet runner." Laura nodded slowly, her expression carrying the weight of terrible certainty. "Robert saw him leaving through the servants' entrance. He realized immediately what David had done, or rather, what he had attempted to do. Robert followed his father, confronted him in the village, and extracted a confession. David was drunk, as he so often was in those days, and the alcohol loosened his tongue sufficiently for him to admit everything. The loosened carpet runner, the calculation that Constance, distracted by what Robert had told her at the bazaar, would descend those stairs without her customary caution." Miss Marple rose slowly and moved to her window, gazing out at the grey afternoon light that rendered St. Mary Mead into shades of muted stone and shadow. "And what did Robert do with this knowledge?" "He was paralyzed by it," Laura said, her voice breaking slightly. "He could not decide whether to expose his father or to permit the police to continue pursuing their investigation in the wrong direction. He came to me this morning, came to the Crown Hotel before dawn, and confessed the entire matter. He asked me what he should do. He asked me, Miss Marple, as though I possessed some moral authority to determine his father's fate." "And what did you advise?" Miss Marple inquired, turning to face her visitor once more. "I told him the truth," Laura said firmly. that his father's actions were indefensible, that concealing them would compound the original crime, and that the only honorable course was to place the matter before the police. I told him that protecting David at this point would be a betrayal not merely of justice, but of Emily, of his niece, who had been victimized by both her grandfather and her grandmother in this elaborate scheme. Miss Marple settled herself once more in her chair, her aged fingers resuming their work with the knitting needles as though the mechanical motion facilitated thought. "Miss Ashworth, I must ask you directly, did you come to me before going to Inspector Graves, or after?" "Before," Laura admitted. "I came to you because I needed to understand whether I was doing the right thing. I've spent 15 years away from this village, away from these people, attempting to construct a life free from the complications and sorrows that bound me here. And yet circumstances have drawn me back, and now I find myself responsible for determining the fate of people I once loved. I needed counsel from someone who understands human nature in all its complexity." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly in the quiet sitting room. "You have made a brave decision, Miss Ashworth. Not a comfortable one, but brave nonetheless. Inspector Graves should receive this information directly, and from David Ashworth himself, if possible. The police have been operating on an incomplete understanding of events, and that incompleteness has led them toward a conclusion that, while logically coherent, does not reflect the true culpability in this matter. Robert is at the police station now," Laura said. "He is providing a full account to Inspector Graves. David is—" She paused, seeming to gather her composure. "David is in the village, though I do not know his precise location. The police are searching for him, but he appears to have disappeared into the anonymity of the surrounding countryside." As if in response to this statement, there came a sharp knock at Miss Marple's door. Lucy appeared moments later, her face flushed from exertion. "Miss Marple, the inspectors sent word that they've found Mr. David Ashworth. He's at the old boathouse down by the river, the one that's been abandoned these past 10 years. The inspector's asking if you might come, Miss Marple. He says there's something you should see before—" Lucy hesitated, searching for the appropriate words. "Before matters proceed further." Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Laura, who had risen from her chair with visible anxiety. "You should remain here," Miss Marple said gently. "What is about to unfold concerns your daughter, and she will need you present in the village, steady and composed, to guide her through what comes next. The girl has endured sufficient upheaval for one lifetime." She rose with the deliberate care required by advancing age, gathered her coat and walking stick, and prepared herself for what she understood would be the final act of this particular tragedy. As she descended her garden path toward the waiting police car, the gray afternoon had begun its transition into premature evening, and the river that bordered the village seemed to flow with unusual darkness and force. The boathouse stood isolated at the water's edge, a structure of weathered wood and declining grace, its windows dark and unwelcoming. Inspector Graves stood outside, his expression grave but not surprised, as though he had expected Miss Marple's arrival with the certainty of natural law. Beside him stood a constable, and beyond them, visible through the boathouse's open door, Miss Marple could perceive a figure sitting upon the wooden dock that extended into the water. David Ashworth looked smaller than Miss Marple remembered him, diminished by years of dissipation and the weight of accumulated guilt. His shoulders were hunched, his hair gray and unkempt, and his hands trembled as they rested upon his knees. He did not look up as Miss Marple approached, though she sensed that he was acutely aware of her presence. "He's been here since this morning," Inspector Graves said quietly, apparently contemplating matters of considerable consequence. "When we arrived, he asked for you specifically, Miss Marple. He asked that you be present before he made his final statement." Miss Marple understood then what was about to be revealed, understood the precise nature of the burden David Ashworth had carried and the reason he had sought her presence at this moment of reckoning. Miss Marple approached the dock with measured steps, acutely aware of the constable's protective positioning and Inspector Graves's watchful attention. The river flowed past with impassive indifference, its waters dark and cold in the fading light. David Ashworth remained motionless until she was nearly beside him, at which point he raised his head with the difficulty of a man whose neck bore the weight of years and suffering combined. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice roughened by alcohol and emotion. "I wasn't certain you would. Laura said you were a woman of principle, but principle is often a luxury afforded only to those who have never been forced to choose between it and survival." "I came," Miss Marple said quietly, settling herself upon the bench beside him with careful attention to her balance, "because Inspector Graves believed my presence would serve some purpose. I suspect he was correct in that assessment, though I do not yet understand precisely what that purpose might be." David turned to face her, and Miss Marple observed the full extent of the damage that time and guilt had wrought upon him. His eyes were red-rimmed, his skin pallid and loose with advanced dissipation. Yet beneath the deterioration, she could perceive traces of the man he had once been, a sensitive, thoughtful person whose weakness had gradually calcified into something far more damaging. "I loved my mother," David said abruptly, as though this statement required utterance above all others. "I know that may seem incomprehensible given what I've done, but it is nonetheless true. She was a formidable woman, exacting and rigid in her principles. Yet I loved her. She raised me alone after my father died. Did you know that? She was barely 30, left with an estate to manage and a young child to raise during a time when such circumstances were considerably more challenging than they are now." Miss Marple inclined her head in acknowledgement. She had, in fact, known this, as she knew most significant facts regarding the village's established families. "When I married Laura," David continued, his words tumbling forth now as though a dam had broken within him, "my mother disapproved violently. Laura was an actress, Miss Marple. Well, an aspiring actress, which my mother deemed even more reprehensible. She felt that I had betrayed the Ashworth name, that I had married beneath my station, that I was throwing away everything she had sacrificed to preserve. She made it clear, in countless small ways, that my marriage was a source of profound disappointment to her." He paused, gazing out at the darkening water. "When Laura left me, I convinced myself that my mother had been vindicated in her original assessment. I told myself that the failure of my marriage proved her correct, that I had been foolish and weak to imagine otherwise. I threw myself into the management of the estate, or attempted to at any rate, but I discovered that I possessed neither my mother's acumen nor her capacity for discipline. The work exhausted me, the weight of expectation crushed me, and gradually I began to drink. As a means of alleviating that weight," Miss Marple observed gently. "Precisely," David acknowledged. "The alcohol provided temporary relief from the constant sense of inadequacy. It permitted me to retreat into a state of pleasant numbness where my failures seemed less significant, where my mother's disappointment seemed less cutting. Yet with each year that passed, my dependence upon it grew, and my financial circumstances deteriorated accordingly." He drew a shaky breath. 8 years ago, my mother approached me with an extraordinary proposal. She had discovered, through her own financial scrutiny, that the trust fund established for Emily had been accumulating considerably more interest than anticipated. She suggested that a portion of this surplus could be diverted to supplement my personal income without adversely affecting Emily's ultimate inheritance. She presented it as a loan that I would eventually repay, but we both understood that repayment was unlikely. Miss Marple's expression remained composed, though her knitting needles, which she had retrieved from her coat pocket, resumed their rhythmic clicking. "I accepted," David continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "It seemed like a miracle, a solution to my financial desperation that required only my complicity and my silence. For 8 years, I received regular distributions. I told myself that no genuine harm was occurring, that the trust fund would still provide adequately for Emily, that my mother had the right to do with her financial resources as she saw fit. Yet you must have recognized, Miss Marple observed, that this arrangement could not continue indefinitely. Emily would eventually come of age and begin to understand the mechanics of her inheritance. Of course I recognized it, David said with a bitter laugh. I'm weak, Miss Marple, but I am not entirely without perception. I knew that eventually the truth would emerge. What I did not anticipate was that Laura would return to the village and would possess both the knowledge and the determination to uncover what had been done. He turned to face Miss Marple directly, and she saw in his expression the fullness of his desperation. When Robert came to me at the bazaar and told me that Laura had discovered everything, that she intended to go to the solicitor, that the entire scheme would be exposed, I panicked. I saw my life collapsing around me. I saw Emily learning that both her grandmother and her grandfather had betrayed her. I saw my mother facing public humiliation and potential legal consequences, and I saw myself facing the full weight of my failures, with no remaining illusions to sustain me. So you went to the manor, Miss Marple said quietly. You loosened the carpet runner, calculating that your mother, distracted by what Robert had told her, might fall. I didn't want to kill her, David said, his voice breaking. I swear to you, Miss Marple, I did not want her death. I wanted an accident, something that would delay the revelation, permit me time to arrange affairs, perhaps even to flee. I thought that if she were hospitalized, incapacitated, the matter of the trust fund might be postponed. I wasn't thinking clearly. The alcohol had clouded my judgment entirely. He covered his face with his hands, and his shoulders shook with the violence of his weeping. Inspector Graves stepped forward to offer support, but Miss Marple raised a hand, indicating that he should permit this moment to unfold without intervention. Sometimes, she understood, a man required the full acknowledgement of his culpability before redemption, however distant, became possible. The autumn darkness had fully descended by the time Miss Marple made her way back through the village, Inspector Graves accompanying her in the police car while David Ashworth sat in the rear vehicle, accompanied by a constable. The confession had been recorded in full, witnessed by both Miss Marple and the police inspector, and David had made no attempt to retract or qualify his admissions. He had, in fact, seemed almost relieved by the prospect of accountability, as though the burden of secrecy had become far more intolerable than the consequences of exposure. Yet as Miss Marple settled herself once more in her sitting room, a cup of tea cradled in her hands, she found herself troubled by a particular inconsistency in the narrative that had been presented. It was a small matter, a detail so subtle that she suspected it had escaped even Inspector Graves' notice, preoccupied as he was with the obvious facts of the case. She sat in contemplative silence for nearly an hour, her knitting forgotten in her lap, working through the implications of what she had observed, and more importantly, what she had not observed. By 9 o'clock that evening, she had reached a conclusion that troubled her considerably. She rose with deliberate purpose and made her way to the telephone, where she placed a call to the police station. Inspector Graves, still engaged in processing the various statements and evidence related to David Ashworth's confession, answered with the particular tone of a man who has experienced considerable emotional and intellectual exhaustion. "Miss Marple," he said, and she could hear the gratification in his voice. "I was hoping you might call. David Ashworth's confession has clarified a great deal, though I confess I remain somewhat puzzled by certain details regarding the timeline. Your presence at the boathouse proved invaluable." "Inspector," Miss Marple said carefully, "I must ask you a question of considerable importance. When your officers examined the manor this morning, did they find any evidence suggesting that David Ashworth had been present in the house? Footprints, disturbance of dust, alterations to locks or windows?" There was a pause on the line. As a matter of fact, they did not. David claimed he entered through the servants' entrance, which he stated remained unlocked. The housekeeper confirms that she habitually leaves that door unlatched during daylight hours, as the scullery maid comes and goes for various errands. However, Miss Marple, this hardly seems remarkable. David is a member of the household, after all, and his presence would not have been unexpected had anyone observed him. And yet, Miss Marple continued, no one did observe him. Neither Mrs. Pemberton nor any of the other servants reported seeing him. That seems curious, does it not? A man known to be in a state of some agitation, moving rapidly, through corridors, visiting the upper landing, surely someone would have encountered him. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" Graves asked, his voice taking on a note of careful attention. "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said slowly, "that we must be cautious about accepting confessions too readily, however apparently sincere they may seem. David Ashworth is an alcoholic man in a state of profound guilt and desperation. He may be confessing to something he did not do, something he has convinced himself he did, or something he wished to do but did not actually accomplish." Graves was silent for a long moment. "You believe Robert Ashworth may have loosened the carpet runner himself, that he may have then pressured his father into confessing?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we should examine the evidence more thoroughly before proceeding. David arrived at the manor at 2 o'clock. Robert claims he was there between 2:15 and 2:30. But Miss Marple, consider, Robert works in solicitors' offices in town. His movements would have been observed. Can his presence at the bazaar be confirmed prior to his arrival there at approximately 3 o'clock? Miss Marple heard the inspector exhale slowly. "I will make inquiries first thing in the morning. However, Miss Marple, this raises a troubling question. If Robert deliberately loosened the carpet runner, if he deliberately created the circumstances that led to his mother's death, what would constitute his motive? He stands to inherit considerably under her will, certainly, but he has never demonstrated financial desperation comparable to his father's." "Motive," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "is often far more complex than simple financial gain. Consider the situation from Robert's perspective. He discovers that his father and his grandmother have been systematically defrauding his niece. He learns that his father has been complicit in this theft for years. He becomes aware that exposure is imminent. What Robert may have perceived was not merely financial impropriety, but the complete moral collapse of his family. He may have believed that if the truth emerged, the Ashworth name would be destroyed beyond redemption." She paused, allowing this to settle. And yet his mother, the matriarch of the family, the woman responsible for this scheme, represented the final obstacle to any possibility of recovery or redemption. With her removed, with David confined to managing his guilt and alcoholism, perhaps Robert believed that he could salvage something from the wreckage. Perhaps he believed that his father, freed from his mother's dominating presence, might find some path toward rehabilitation. "That is considerable speculation," Graves observed. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "which is precisely why we must examine the physical evidence more rigorously before proceeding further. I would also suggest, Inspector, that you speak with Emily Prescott regarding her knowledge of her grandfather's situation. The girl is sensitive and observant. She may have become aware of details that others overlooked." After disconnecting from the telephone, Miss Marple resumed her position in her chair, though she did not retrieve her knitting. Instead, she sat in the gathering silence of her sitting room, listening to the sounds of the village settling into night, the distant lowing of cattle from surrounding farms, the occasional motor car passing on the high street, the wind moving through the bare branches of the oak trees that bordered her garden. Somewhere in that darkness, the truth remained partially obscured, waiting for the precise moment when the remaining shadows would be illuminated and the final pieces of the puzzle would fall into their appointed places. Inspector Graves's inquiries into Robert Ashworth's movements on the afternoon of the bazaar proceeded with meticulous care the following morning. What emerged was a pattern considerably more complex than the initial investigation had suggested. Robert's secretary confirmed that he had left his office at approximately 1:30, ostensibly to attend to estate business. However, the clerk at the solicitor's firm, where Robert occasionally conducted legal consultations, reported that Robert had not appeared for their scheduled appointment at 2 o'clock. More significantly, the innkeeper at the Crown Hotel, prompted by specific questioning regarding Robert's visits, recalled observing Robert's motor car parked near the manor at approximately 2:15. By mid-morning, Inspector Graves arrived at Miss Marple's residence with a gravity of expression that suggested his investigation had yielded results of considerable significance. He accepted her offer of tea and settled himself across from her with the air of a man preparing to discuss matters of delicate complexity. "You were correct," he said without preamble. Robert Ashworth was at the manor during the critical time period. Moreover, we have now established that he remained there until nearly 3 o'clock, at which point he drove directly to the bazaar. His secretary has admitted that Robert instructed her to lie regarding his movements should the police make inquiries, telling her that he had been conducting sensitive estate business that required discretion. Miss Marple set down her teacup with measured care. "And what does Mr. Ashworth claim when confronted with this evidence?" "That is where matters become substantially more complicated," Graves said, withdrawing a notebook from his pocket. "Robert admits to being at the manor, but he denies loosening the carpet runner. Instead, he claims he was searching his mother's private study for certain documents he believes she possessed, documents relating to the trust fund arrangement. He states that he discovered correspondence between his mother and his father regarding the financial irregularities, and that he confronted his father with this evidence while David was at the manor." "And what was David's response to this confrontation?" Miss Marple inquired. According to Robert, his father became distraught. David apparently admitted everything: the years of theft, the complicity of his mother, the entire scheme. Robert states that he left his father at the manor in considerable emotional distress and proceeded to the bazaar, where he attempted to discuss the matter with his mother in low tones. He claims this conversation precipitated his mother's agitated departure. Miss Marple rose and moved to her window, gazing out at the village as it proceeded through its ordinary routines, oblivious to the complexity unfolding beneath the surface of daily life. "Inspector, did young Emily Prescott provide you with any additional information?" "As a matter of fact, she did," Graves replied, consulting his notes. When questioned regarding the cream-colored cardigan, Emily admitted that her mother had sent it to her, not to the bazaar, but directly to the manor. Laura had included a note explaining that the cardigan had belonged to Emily when she was a small child, that it had been one of her favorite possessions before Laura's departure. Laura wished Emily to have it back as a symbol of reconnection. He paused, allowing this information to settle. However, Emily states that when she discovered the cardigan had been donated to the bazaar, she experienced considerable distress. She felt that her mother's gift had been appropriated, displayed publicly, treated as merely another item for charitable sale. She was devastated by what she interpreted as a betrayal of her mother's intention. "And who do you believe placed the cardigan in the bazaar collection?" Miss Marple asked quietly. "That is the matter which troubles me considerably," Graves admitted. "Emily states that she never received the cardigan directly. She observed it at the bazaar, already donated and arranged on the linen table. Her initial reaction was one of shock and hurt. She did not immediately recognize it as belonging to her, which is why her distress was visible but not immediately explicable to observers." Miss Marple returned to her chair and retrieved her knitting, the pale lavender cardigan nearly complete now. "I suspect, Inspector, that someone at the manor placed that cardigan in the bazaar collection. Someone who wished for Emily to observe it, who anticipated that her reaction would be one of emotional distress. Someone who understood that Emily's distress would reach her grandmother and that it would contribute to a state of agitation in Constance's mind." "You are suggesting premeditation of a very particular sort," Graves observed. "I am suggesting," Miss Marple corrected gently, "that we must consider the psychological dimensions of this crime alongside the physical evidence. Someone loosened that carpet runner not merely to cause an accident, but to cause an accident in a specific psychological state, a state of distraction and emotional upheaval. The cardigan was placed in the bazaar, not by accident, but deliberately, as a mechanism for generating that precise state of mind." She set down her needles and regarded the inspector with the full weight of her understanding. "I would recommend, Inspector, that you examine the household accounts at the manor with particular attention to any unusual transactions or expenditures. I would also suggest that you speak with Mrs. Pemberton regarding her exact movements on the morning before the bazaar. And most significantly, I would urge you to question Emily Prescott regarding whether anyone at the manor suggested to her that the cardigan should be donated, whether anyone planted the idea that her mother's gift should be contributed to the charity event." Graves rose from his chair, his expression thoughtful. "You believe Emily may have been manipulated into placing the cardigan at the bazaar herself?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that someone very clever may have orchestrated a sequence of events designed to appear as though they were the result of chance and carelessness, rather than deliberate intention. Someone who understood precisely how the human heart responds to betrayal, how a sensitive young girl might act impulsively if she believed herself betrayed by someone she loved." As Inspector Graves departed to pursue these new lines of inquiry, Miss Marple settled back into her chair and resumed her knitting with renewed focus. The pale lavender cardigan was nearly complete, just a few rows remaining before it would be finished. She worked methodically, her aged fingers moving with practiced precision, understanding that the final revelation was approaching with the inevitability of nightfall, and that when it came, it would be far more terrible and complex than any of them had yet imagined. The interview between Inspector Graves and Emily Prescott took place in a small room at the police station, with a female constable present to ensure the propriety of the proceedings. Emily, dressed in her school uniform despite it being a Saturday, appeared even more fragile than Miss Marple remembered, a girl of 16 whose sensitive nature had been buffeted by revelations far beyond what her years should have required her to comprehend. Inspector Graves approached the questioning with considerable gentleness, beginning with peripheral matters before gradually directing his attention toward the specific question of the cream-colored cardigan. Emily's initial responses were forthcoming and straightforward. Yes, her mother had written to her about the cardigan. Yes, she had been moved by the gesture. No, she had not received it directly, but had been surprised to discover it at the bazaar. It was only when Graves asked her specifically who had suggested that the cardigan should be donated to the charity that Emily's composure began to fracture visibly. "I don't know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I assumed that grandmother had arranged it. When I saw it at the bazaar, I thought she must have decided to donate Mother's gift on my behalf. I thought it was a way of rejecting Mother, of showing that we didn't value her attempts at reconciliation." "But did your grandmother actually tell you this?" Graves pressed gently. "Did she explicitly state that she intended to donate the cardigan?" Emily shook her head, tears beginning to form at the corners of her eyes. No, someone must have mentioned it. Someone said something about Mother sending things to the house, and that maybe grandmother thought it was inappropriate for me to have things from Mother when she'd abandoned us. I can't remember precisely who said it." Inspector Graves exchanged a glance with the female constable. "Emily, I need you to think very carefully about this. Who spoke to you about your mother's gift? Was it your father, your Uncle Robert, Mrs. Pemberton?" The girl's face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands. "It was Uncle Robert," she said, her voice muffled by her palms. "He came to me 3 days before the bazaar. He said that grandmother was upset about Mother's return, that she felt Mother was trying to buy her way back into the family's affections. He said that if I truly wanted to show grandmother that I understood the seriousness of what Mother had done, abandoning Father, abandoning us all, I should permit him to donate the cardigan to the bazaar. He said it would demonstrate that I wasn't being manipulated by Mother's attempts at reconciliation." She looked up, her young face ravaged by the realization of her own manipulation. "He said it would help grandmother feel better. He said it would help the whole family. I just wanted to help. I didn't understand. I didn't realize." Her voice dissolved into tears, and the female constable moved to offer comfort while Inspector Graves stepped out of the interview room. when he emerged into the corridor where Miss Marple sat waiting on a bench, having been invited by Graves to observe the proceedings from an adjacent room with a connecting window. His expression was grim. Robert Ashworth deliberately manipulated his niece into placing the cardigan at the bazaar, Graves said, his voice tight with controlled anger. He orchestrated this entire sequence of events with considerable premeditation. He knew that Emily would become distressed upon seeing the cardigan displayed. He knew that her distress would reach her grandmother. He anticipated precisely how Constance would interpret the gesture. And he knew, Miss Marple said quietly, that a woman already agitated by her grandson's accusations regarding the trust fund would descend those stairs in a state of profound emotional upheaval, her mind occupied with thoughts of betrayal and rejection. A woman in such a state would not exercise her customary caution. A woman in such a state might very well fail to notice a loosened carpet. "Runner." Graves nodded slowly. "We found evidence at the manor confirming that Robert had obtained the necessary tools to loosen the carpet runner's securing rods several days prior to the bazaar. He had discussed estate maintenance with the groundskeeper, ostensibly to gather information about the manor's various repair needs. His questions specifically concerned the condition and security of the stair carpet." The inspector moved to stand beside Miss Marple, gazing down at the elderly woman with profound respect. "You recognized the complexity of this crime from the very beginning, didn't you? You understood that it was not a simple act of violence, but a carefully constructed psychological manipulation." "I observed certain patterns," Miss Marple acknowledged, "that suggested something more intricate than a straightforward push down a staircase. The cream-colored cardigan was the crucial detail. It represented not merely a gift from Laura to Emily, but a symbol of emotional reconnection. Someone who wished to precipitate an accident would have recognized the tremendous emotional significance that particular garment held. Someone who wished to ensure that accident occurred would have engineered its discovery in a manner calculated to cause maximum distress." She paused, her weathered hands folded in her lap. "Robert Ashworth is an intelligent man, Inspector. He is not, I suspect, a man naturally inclined toward violence or criminality. Yet he became convinced that his mother's death was necessary, not for financial gain, but for the preservation of the family's reputation and the possibility of redemption for his father. He persuaded himself that he was acting in service of a greater good, that the accident he was engineering was a regrettable but necessary consequence of his mother's moral failings. That does not excuse what he has done," Graves said firmly. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It does not excuse it, but it explains it, and understanding is often the necessary precursor to justice. Robert Ashworth must face the consequences of his actions. Yet he is also a victim in his fashion, a victim of his mother's dominance, his father's weakness, and his own desperate belief that he could somehow engineer a solution to an essentially unsolvable moral crisis." As Miss Marple rose to depart, supported by Inspector Graves' arm, she reflected on the terrible complexity of human motivation. Robert Ashworth had not been driven by greed or passion, but by a twisted attempt at redemption. He had believed that if he removed his mother from the equation, his father might find recovery, his niece might find peace, and his family's name might be salvaged. Instead, he had destroyed everything he sought to preserve, and in doing so had revealed the dark truth that even our most noble intentions can lead us toward evil. Robert Ashworth's arrest took place on a grey Saturday afternoon, precisely 1 week after his mother's death. He did not resist when Inspector Graves arrived at his office with a warrant. Instead, he seemed almost relieved, as though the burden of maintaining his constructed innocence had become unbearable, and confession offered a form of liberation despite the terrible consequences it would entail. The formal charges were filed on Monday morning, murder in the second degree, with the Crown prosecutor arguing that while Robert had not directly pushed his mother down the stairs, he had deliberately engineered circumstances specifically designed to cause her death. His defense solicitor would later argue for manslaughter, citing Robert's emotional state and his lack of direct physical violence. But the evidence was overwhelming. The loosened carpet runner, the deliberate manipulation of Emily, the careful orchestration of events designed to place Constance Ashworth in a state of emotional fragility at the precise moment she would descend those stairs. Miss Marple attended the preliminary hearing, sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, her knitting needles clicking softly as she observed the proceedings with her characteristic attention to detail. She watched Robert sit in the dock, his face a study in resigned acceptance. She observed the reactions of those who had been drawn into the orbit of this terrible crime. David Ashworth sat in the public gallery, his complexion grey, his hands trembling as he gripped the railing before him. Laura Ashworth sat beside him, her expression unreadable, though Miss Marple noted the way she occasionally turned to look at David with something that might have been compassion or might have been profound pity. Emily was not present. Inspector Graves had made arrangements for the girl to be spared the necessity of appearing in court, at least for this preliminary hearing. The psychological toll of her unwitting complicity in her grandmother's death was already considerable. Forcing her to confront the full implications of Robert's manipulation seemed unnecessarily cruel. It was 3 days after the preliminary hearing that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Laura Ashworth appeared at her door in mid-afternoon, dressed in a dark coat despite the relative mildness of the weather. She looked as though she had aged a decade in the space of a week. Her face drawn, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and something far more profound than mere physical fatigue. "I'm leaving St. Mary Mead," Laura said without preamble, once they had settled themselves in Miss Marple's sitting room with tea that neither woman showed any inclination to consume. "I've made arrangements for Emily to continue her schooling in London, where I have secured a position with a theatrical company. David has agreed to this arrangement, though his agreement is motivated primarily by his own desire for solitude and continued access to alcohol." Miss Marple inclined her head in acknowledgement, though she made no immediate response. She had learned long ago that silence often permitted others to speak truths they might otherwise conceal. "I came back to St. Mary Mead believing that I might recover something of what I had lost," Laura continued, her voice carrying the weight of bitter self-knowledge. "I believed that years away had granted me sufficient perspective to engage with my past in a mature and constructive manner. I believed that I might form a genuine relationship with my daughter, might help my ex-husband find some path toward healing, might even achieve some form of reconciliation with Constance." She paused, her hands trembling as they rested in her lap. "Instead, I have been the catalyst for tragedy. If I had not returned, if I had not discovered the financial improprieties, if I had not threatened to expose them, Constance would still be alive. Robert would not be facing a murder charge. Emily would not be carrying the terrible burden of having inadvertently participated in her grandmother's death." "Miss Ashworth," Miss Marple said gently, "you are not responsible for Robert Ashworth's choices. He alone decided to loosen that carpet runner. He alone chose to manipulate his niece. He alone orchestrated the events that led to his mother's death." "And yet," Laura said, "if circumstances had been different, if I had remained in London, if I had not forced matters to a crisis, none of this would have occurred." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "You speak as though human events exist in some sort of causal vacuum, as though responsibility can be assigned with mathematical precision. But I have learned over many decades of observation that life is far more complicated than such a framework permits. Yes, your return to St. Mary Mead precipitated a chain of events, but David's theft precipitated that event. Constance's financial impropriety precipitated David's theft, and Robert's belief that he could somehow engineer redemption through his mother's death, that precipitated everything that followed." She regarded Laura with eyes that had observed human nature in all its complexity and contradiction. You returned to St. Mary Mead seeking reconciliation and truth. Both are worthwhile pursuits, however painful their consequences may be. Robert Ashworth chose a different path. He chose deception, manipulation, and ultimately, murder. That choice was his alone. Laura rose from her chair, though she remained for a moment longer, as though gathering courage for final words. Will you come to say goodbye to Emily before we depart? She has spoken of you often. She believes you understand things about people that others miss. I think it would comfort her to know that you see her not as a villain in this tragedy, but as a victim of her uncle's manipulation. Miss Marple rose as well, moving with the careful deliberation required by her advancing age. I will come tomorrow afternoon, she said. I have nearly completed a cardigan that I believe Emily should have. It is pale lavender. Color that suits young women with dark hair and sensitive dispositions. I should very much like to present it to her before her departure. The following afternoon found Miss Marple at the Crown Hotel, seated in Laura's modest suite with Emily beside her on the sofa. The girl's eyes were red from recent weeping, and her hands constantly sought something to occupy themselves, picking at threads on her sleeve, twisting a handkerchief, any small fidgeting motion that might discharge some portion of her emotional distress. Miss Marple presented the cardigan, which she had completed that very morning, finishing the final seam with particular care. Emily received it with trembling hands, examining the perfect stitching, the soft quality of the wool, the meticulous construction that represented hours of Miss Marple's patient attention. I don't deserve this, Emily said, her voice barely audible. I was part of what happened. I helped Uncle Robert. I placed the cardigan at the bazaar. It's because of me that Grandmother— You were manipulated, Miss Marple interrupted gently but firmly. You were a sensitive young girl who wished to please her family and to prevent harm. Your uncle exploited those natural inclinations. That does not make you complicit in his crime. It makes you a victim of his moral bankruptcy. She took the girl's hand in her own, her aged fingers surprisingly warm and strong. You have learned a terrible lesson about the complexity of human nature and the capacity for evil that can exist within even intelligent and seemingly well-intentioned people. That knowledge will make you more cautious in future, perhaps more prone to skepticism regarding the motives of others. That is not a bad thing, though I hope you will not permit it to embitter you entirely. Emily wept quietly, her young shoulders shaking with the release of accumulated guilt and sorrow. Miss Marple held her hand and said nothing more, understanding that sometimes silence and simple human presence constituted the only comfort available in the face of terrible understanding. When Miss Marple departed from the Crown Hotel, the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead's familiar streets. She made her way home slowly, her walking stick tapping against the pavement with the steady rhythm of measured progress. The village seemed somehow diminished by recent events, as though the revelation of such darkness had somehow reduced it, made it seem less substantial than it had appeared before. Yet as she settled into her armchair that evening, as she prepared to begin work on a new project, a simple blue cardigan for a distant cousin, Miss Marple reflected that villages were not diminished by the exposure of their secrets. Rather, they were revealed in their true nature, places inhabited by flawed and complex human beings, capable of both profound kindness and terrible cruelty, capable of both redemption and damnation. Robert Ashworth would face trial. David Ashworth would continue his slow dissolution through alcohol and guilt. Emily would carry the weight of her inadvertent complicity throughout her life. Laura would attempt to reconstruct her existence in London, forever marked by the tragedy that had unfolded in her brief return to her past. And Constance Ashworth would remain dead, her moral failings revealed to the village, her reputation irrevocably damaged by the financial improprieties she had committed. This was the reality of human consequence. This was the price of deception and the cost of attempting to engineer redemption through violence and manipulation. And this, Miss Marple understood with the clarity of 83 years of observation, was the eternal lesson that St. Mary Mead would now carry forward, that in small villages, as in great cities, human nature remained fundamentally unchanged by circumstance or distance, eternally vulnerable to the temptations of pride, greed, and the dangerous belief that one could somehow correct the course of fate through one's own will alone. The pale lavender cardigan lay folded perfectly on Miss Marple's settee, awaiting only her great-niece's arrival for Christmas. And in the gathering darkness of an English autumn, the village settled into the peculiar peace that follows the revelation of terrible truths, a peace born not of innocence, but of the hard-won acknowledgement that evil had been named, confronted, and would now face the slow machinery of justice.